Think your gym socks are bad? Imagine sharing a wooden comb with your entire village, rinsing your hair with fermented lye, and wiping with moss. In the medieval world, dirt wasn't just common, it was a lifestyle. And your modern nose wouldn't stand a chance if you've ever taken indoor plumbing for granted. This episode will make you kiss your bathroom floor. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for more. Sleepy tales from history's filthiest corners. Comment below, which of these hygiene horrors would have broken you first? You wake up in medieval Europe, perhaps in the year 1347, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the absence of an alarm clock or electric lights, it's the smell. The air carries a complex bouquet of scents that your modern nose would find. Overwhelming wood smoke, animal dung, unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, and the persistent odor of human waste that seemed to permeate every corner of daily life. Yet, contrary to popular belief, medieval people weren't entirely indifferent to cleanliness. They simply lived in a world where the standards and methods of hygiene were so fundamentally different from ours that their daily routines would seem both fascinating and revolting to modern sensibilities. The morning ritual of a typical medieval person began not with a shower, but with what they called the morning wash, a practice so universal that it was mentioned in countless contemporary texts and household manuals. You would reach for an ewar, a large ceramic pitcher filled with cold water, and pour it into a shallow basin. This wasn't the refreshing cascade of hot water you might expect, but rather a bracing splash of whatever temperature the water happened to be, often barely above freezing in winter months. The ritual was methodical, first the face, then the hands, sometimes extending to the neck and forearms if you were particularly fastidious or if social circumstances demanded it. But here's where the medieval world reveals its first disgusting reality. That basin of water might serve not just you, but your entire family. Water was precious. It had to be drawn from wells, carried from streams, or collected from rain. And heating it required fuel that was often scarce and expensive. A single basin of water might wash the faces of a dozen people before being discarded. And by the end of that chain, you can imagine the murky, scum-covered liquid that remained. The water would grow progressively grayer, picking up the accumulated dirt, dead skin, dried sweat, and whatever cosmetic substances people used to mask their odor, substances that were often made from animal fats, plant dyes, and minerals that would leave their own residue. Medieval people understood that certain parts of the body required more attention than others, hands being the primary tools for eating, working, and social interaction, received the most frequent washing. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about survival and social acceptance. In a world where most people ate with their fingers, dirty hands could literally mean the difference between life and death through the spread of disease. The practice was so important that it was encoded in religious texts, etiquette manuals, and even legal documents. A person who failed to wash their hands before a meal wasn't just being rude. They were violating fundamental social contracts that held communities together. The soap available to medieval people, when it existed at all, bore little resemblance to the mild, fragrant bars we use today. Medieval soap was typically made from animal fats, softened the rendered fat from pigs, cattle, or sheep mixed with lye created from wood ash. The result was a harsh, caustic substance that could strip skin raw if used too liberally. The wealthy might have access to soap made with olive oil, imported at great expense from Mediterranean regions. But for most people, soap was a luxury item used sparingly, if at all. More commonly, people relied on abrasive materials like sand, rough cloth, or even handfuls of herbs to scrub away the day's accumulation of grime. Hair washing presented its own unique challenges and created some of the most revolting aspects of medieval hygiene. People would create alkaline solutions by mixing lime with salt, creating a chemical mixture that could burn skin and eyes, but was effective at cutting through the grease and dirt that accumulated in unwashed hair. Women, whose hair was often their crowning glory and a sign of their social status, would subject their scalps to these caustic treatments, enduring chemical burns in pursuit of cleanliness. The process would leave hair brittle and damaged, but it was preferable to the alternative hair so matted with grease, dirt, and debris that it became a breeding ground for parasites. The frequency of these washing rituals varied dramatically based on social class. But even among the wealthy, daily washing was far from universal. Most people engaged in a thorough cleaning of their exposed body parts, face, hands, and neck each. Morning but full body washing was reserved for special occasions or weekly routines. The poor might go weeks without anything approaching a full wash, while the wealthy might indulge in the luxury of a weekly bath, complete with heated water and scented oils. But even among the aristocracy, the logistics of bathing were so complex and resource-intensive that it remained an infrequent pleasure rather than a daily necessity. What makes this morning ritual particularly disgusting from a modern perspective is the complete absence of understanding about bacteria and germs. Medieval people had no conception of the microscopic organisms that cause disease, infection, and decay. They cleaned themselves based on social expectations, religious requirements, and aesthetic preferences. But they had no scientific foundation for understanding why cleanliness mattered beyond the immediate sensory experience. This meant that their cleaning methods, while well-intentioned, often spread contamination rather than eliminating it. As you imagine yourself going through this morning routine in medieval times, consider the sensory experience that would assault you daily. The water would be shockingly cold against your skin. The soap would burn and sting. And despite your best efforts, you would carry with you throughout the day the accumulated sense of your environment, wood smoke in your hair, animal odors on your clothes, and the persistent background aroma of human waste that was simply an accepted part of medieval life. This was cleanliness in an age before modern sanitation, and it was a far cry from the sterile, refreshing experience we associate with personal hygiene today. Yet there's something almost admirable about the dedication medieval people showed to maintaining what cleanliness they could in such challenging circumstances. They developed intricate rituals and social customs around washing, created ingenious tools and techniques for cleaning their bodies, and maintained standards of personal presentation that, while different from ours, represented a genuine attempt to live with dignity in a world that was, by modern standards, almost unimaginably filthy. The concept of a weekly bath in medieval times wasn't just about cleanliness, it was a complex social, economic, and logistical undertaking that reveals much about how people lived, worked, and prioritized their resources in an age of scarcity. When medieval people spoke of taking a bath, they weren't referring to the quick, private experience you might have in your modern bathroom, but rather to an elaborate process that could take hours to prepare and involve the entire household. In its execution, the preparation for a medieval bath began long before any water touched skin. First, there was the matter of acquiring enough water, a resource that was far more precious than we can easily imagine today. For those living in rural areas, water had to be drawn from wells, carried from streams, or collected from rain. A full bath might require dozens of buckets of water, each one representing a significant expenditure of physical labor. In winter, months when streams might freeze and wells could run dry. Obtaining sufficient water for bathing became an even more daunting challenge. The water then had to be heated, which meant burning precious fuel wood, charcoal, or dried dung in quantities that could represent a significant portion of a household's energy resources for an entire week. The bathing vessel itself was typically a wooden half-barrel or tub, often reinforced with metal bands and lined with cloth to prevent splinters. These tubs were valuable household items, passed down through generations and carefully maintained. The wealthy might own larger, more elaborate tubs, sometimes with built-in seats or cushioned areas for comfort. But even these luxurious versions would seem primitive by modern standards. The tub had to be positioned carefully, usually near a hearth for warmth and close enough to the kitchen for easy transport of hot water, but far enough away to avoid contamination from cooking fires and food preparation. What makes the medieval bathing experience particularly revolting from a modern perspective is the concept of shared bathwater. Once that precious, laboriously heated water was in the tub, it wasn't used by just one person. Family members would bathe in order of social importance, typically the eldest male first, followed by other men in order of age and status, then women, and finally children. By the time the last person entered the bath, the water would be a murky, scum-covered soup of human oils, dead skin, hair, and whatever dirt and debris had been washed off the previous bathers. The phrase, "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," originated from this practice, as the water would become so opaque by the end of the bathing session that a small child could literally be lost in the murky depths. The bathing process itself involves scrubbing with rough cloths, handfuls of herbs, and sometimes abrasive materials like sand or salt. People would use whatever cleaning agents were available perhaps, some of that harsh, lye-based soap, or more commonly, a paste made from ground herbs, animal fats, and ash. The goal wasn't just to remove visible dirt, but to address the persistent body odors that were an inescapable part of medieval life. People lived in close quarters with animals, worked with their hands in soil and refuse, and wore the same clothes for weeks or months at a time. A weekly bath was as much about making oneself tolerable to others as it was about personal comfort. Public bathhouses, where they existed, presented their own unique hygiene challenges. These establishments, found in larger towns and cities, offered the luxury of professionally heated and maintained bathing facilities, but they came with social and health risks that would horrify modern sensibilities. The bathhouses were communal spaces where dozens of people might share the same pools of water throughout the day. Fresh water wasn't added between users. Instead, the same water served customer after customer, accumulating layers of human waste, sweat, oils, and whatever diseases or infections the bathers might carry. These public bathing establishments often served multiple functions beyond simple hygiene. They were social gathering places where people conducted business, shared gossip, and engaged in activities that would make them comparable to modern-day spas, taverns, and sometimes brothels, all rolled into one. The mixing of social classes, genders, and ages in these steamy, crowded spaces created an environment where diseases could spread rapidly. By the late medieval period, public bathhouses were increasingly associated with the spread of syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, leading to their gradual decline and eventual closure in many areas. For the wealthy, bathing was often accompanied by additional luxuries that seem both appealing and disgusting from a modern perspective. Nobles might add herbs, flowers, or even wine to their bathwater, creating aromatic concoctions that were supposed to have medicinal or beautifying properties. They might employ servants to scrub their backs, wash their hair, or massage their bodies with oils and perfumes. But even these luxurious baths took place in the same type of shared, reused water that characterized all medieval bathing, and the herbs and additives often created a kind of organic soup that would harbor bacteria and other microorganisms. The aftermath of a medieval bath was almost as elaborate as the preparation. The used bathwater, now a cocktail of human fluids and whatever cleaning agents had been employed, had to be disposed of. In urban areas, this might mean dumping it into the street, adding to the general filth that characterized medieval city life. In rural areas, it might be used to water gardens or dispose of in nearby streams, contributing to the contamination of water sources that people would later use for drinking and cooking. Medieval people understood that bathing, while beneficial, also carried risks. Medical texts of the period warned about the dangers of bathing too frequently, believing that excessive washing could weaken the body's natural defenses and make people more susceptible to disease. This wasn't entirely wrong in an age without understanding of bacteria and infection. The communal bathing facilities and shared water could indeed spread diseases more effectively than they prevented them. The religious attitudes toward bathing added another layer of complexity to medieval hygiene practices. While cleanliness was generally valued and often mandated by religious authorities, there was also a strand of Christian thought that viewed excessive attention to bodily cleanliness as vanity or luxury that distracted from spiritual concerns. Monks and nuns were often restricted in their bathing frequency, allowed only a few full baths per year. This religious tension between bodily cleanliness and spiritual purity created a cultural ambivalence about bathing that influenced practices across all social classes. Despite all these challenges and disgusting realities, the weekly bath remained an important ritual in medieval life. It represented a triumph of human ingenuity and determination over the harsh realities of pre-modern existence. People found ways to maintain cleanliness and dignity, even in circumstances that seem almost impossible to modern minds. And they created social customs and practices around bathing that served important community functions beyond simple hygiene. The olfactory landscape of medieval Europe was so fundamentally different from our modern experience that it would require a complete recalibration of your sensory expectations to survive even a single day in that environment. Body odor wasn't just an occasional embarrassment to be quickly remedied with deodorant and a shower, was the persistent, inescapable backdrop to every human interaction, a complex symphony of scents that told stories about social class, occupation, health, and personal habits in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. To understand the magnitude of medieval body odor, you must first consider the clothing that people wore and how rarely it was washed. The typical medieval person owned very few garments, perhaps 2 or 3 complete outfits if they were relatively prosperous, and possibly only 1 set of clothes if they were poor. These garments were made primarily from wool, linen, or leather, all of which absorbed and retained odors with remarkable tenacity. A woolen tunic might be worn continuously for weeks or even months without washing, gradually accumulating layers of sweat. Food stains, smoke from cooking fires, animal odors from livestock, and the general grime of daily life in a world without modern sanitation. The undergarments, when they existed at all, were made from rough linen that chafed against the skin and absorbed bodily fluids and odors. These linen undergarments were changed more frequently than outer clothing, but frequently in medieval terms might mean once a week or even less often. The wealthy could afford to have multiple sets of undergarments and could employ servants to wash them more regularly, but for the majority of the population, the same linen shift or brise medieval underwear would be worn until it literally began to disintegrate from accumulated filth and wear. The process of washing clothes was so labor-intensive and resource-consuming that it was typically done only a few times per year. Clothing had to be soaked in water that was heated over fires, beaten with wooden paddles to loosen dirt, scrubbed with harsh soap that could damage the fabric, and then hung to dry in whatever weather conditions prevailed. In winter months, clothes might take days or weeks to dry completely, during which time they would develop their own musty, mildewed odors that would persist even after they were supposedly clean. Medieval people developed sophisticated strategies for managing body odor that reveal both their ingenuity and the severity of the problem they faced. Wealthy individuals would wear small sachets of herbs and spices, lavender, rosemary, thyme, or more exotic imported spices sewn into their clothing or carried in small pouches. These aromatic bags were meant to mask body odors, but they often created a strange olfactory cocktail where human scents mingled with herbal fragrances in ways that would seem overwhelming to modern sensibilities. Perfumes and scented oils were luxury items available only to the wealthy and they were used not as subtle enhancements to cleanliness, but as powerful masking agents applied liberally to combat persistent body odors. These medieval perfumes were often made from animal musks, flower essences dissolved in alcohol or oil, and various aromatic substances that were believed to have medicinal properties. The result was often a cloying, overpowering scent that attempted to completely overwhelm natural body odors rather than complement them. The medical understanding of body odor in medieval times was based on the theory of the four humors blood. Phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were believed to govern all aspects of human health and character. Strong body odors were seen as evidence of imbalanced humors, and various treatments were prescribed to address these imbalances. People might consume specific foods, herbs, or medicines to alter their natural scent, or they might undergo bloodletting, purging, or other medical procedures designed to rebalance their humoral composition and thereby reduce offensive odors. Different occupations created their own characteristic odors that became part of social identity and class recognition. Blacksmiths carried the permanent scent of coal smoke and heated metal. Tanners reeked of the animal urine and feces used in leather processing. Farmers smelled of manure, hay, and animal sweat. Butchers were permeated with the odors of blood and decomposing meat. These occupational scents were so distinctive and persistent that they became part of social stereotyping and class identification. You could often determine someone's trade and social status simply by their smell. The close living quarters of medieval life meant that personal body odors were constantly mingling and compounding. Entire families lived in single rooms, sleeping together in shared beds, working in cramped spaces, and spending their days in close physical proximity to each other and their animals. The accumulated body odors of multiple people, combined with the smells of cooking, waste disposal, and animal husbandry, created olfactory environments that would be literally nauseating to modern people. Seasonal variations in body odor presented additional challenges. Summer heat would intensify all scents, causing people to sweat more profusely while making it more difficult to tolerate heavy layered clothing. Winter months brought their own problems, as people wore the same clothes continuously for warmth and bathed even less frequently due to the difficulty of heating water and the risks of catching cold. The practice of layering multiple garments for warmth meant that body odors were trapped between layers of fabric, creating concentrated pockets of scent that would be released whenever clothing was adjusted or removed. Medieval people also had to contend with the fact that their diet significantly influenced their body odor in ways that modern processed foods rarely do. People who ate large quantities of garlic, onions, and other pungent vegetables would exude these scents through their skin and breath for days afterward. Those whose diets consisted mainly of preserved meats, fermented foods, and ale would carry the distinctive odors of these foods as part of their personal scent profile. The wealthy, who had access to spices and varied foods, might have more complex and sometimes more pleasant body odors, but they were still operating within the same basic framework of limited washing and clothing changes. The social implications of body odor in medieval society were complex and nuanced. While strong scents were generally unavoidable and therefore tolerated, there were still social expectations about managing one's odor as much as possible. People who made no effort to mask or reduce their body odors might be seen as slovenly or inconsiderate, while those who used too many masking scents might be perceived as vain or pretentious. The art of medieval social interaction included the ability to navigate these olfactory social cues and maintain appropriate relationships despite the constant presence of strong personal scents. Religious authorities had complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward body odor and the efforts to mask it. While cleanliness was generally encouraged as a sign of spiritual purity, excessive use of perfumes and scented oils was sometimes condemned as vanity or worldly indulgence. Some religious texts suggested that the natural scents of the human body were part of God's creation and should be accepted rather than disguised, while others encouraged the use of aromatic herbs and substances as part of maintaining health and social harmony. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people developed such sophisticated tolerance for body odors that they could detect subtle variations and changes in scent that would be completely imperceptible to modern people. They could identify illness, emotional states, dietary changes, and even character traits based on personal sense in ways that seem almost superhuman to us today. This olfactory literacy was a necessary survival skill in a world where smell provided crucial information about health, safety, and social relationships. Living with unavoidable body odor in medieval times wasn't just about tolerance, it was about developing an entirely different relationship with the human body and its natural functions. People learned to find beauty, comfort, and even intimacy within olfactory environments that we would find completely intolerable, and they created rich cultural meanings and social practices around scents that we can barely imagine today. Picture yourself lying on a rough wooden table in a medieval physician's chamber, surrounded by the tools of a trade that would seem like torture devices to modern eyes. The room reeks of old blood, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic scent of iron instruments that have never known the sterility of modern sterilization techniques. Above you, a barber surgeon prepares to perform bloodletting, the most common medical procedure of the medieval world. Using instruments that have been used on dozens of other patients without ever being properly cleaned. The practice of bloodletting in medieval Europe was based on the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile choler, and black bile melancholy, which supposedly governed all aspects of human health and character. Medieval physicians believed that illness resulted from an imbalance of these humors, and that removing excess blood could restore the proper balance and cure everything from headaches to plague. What makes this practice particularly horrifying, from a modern perspective, isn't just the medical ineffectiveness, but the complete absence of any understanding about infection, bacteria, or basic sanitation. The instruments used for bloodletting were crude, often handmade tools that bore little resemblance to modern surgical instruments. The most common was the phlegm, a sharp, pointed blade attached to a handle designed to make quick, deep cuts in veins. These phlegms were typically made of iron or steel that would rust and corrode with use, creating rough, jagged edges that would tear flesh rather than make clean incisions. The instruments were rarely, if ever, cleaned between patients. A single phlegm might be used on dozens of people in a single day, accumulating layers of dried blood, skin fragments, and whatever diseases the previous patients might have carried. The procedure itself was a nightmare of unsanitary conditions that would violate every modern medical protocol imaginable. The barber surgeon, who often performed bloodletting alongside his regular duties of cutting hair and performing minor surgery, would rarely wash his hands before the procedure. His hands might still carry the remnants of his previous activities, perhaps. Animal blood from slaughtering livestock, human waste from emptying chamber pots, or the accumulated grime of his daily life in a world without soap or running water. The patient's skin was rarely cleaned before the procedure. The barber surgeon would simply identify the vein he wanted to open, typically in the arm, but sometimes in the neck, temple, or other locations, and make his incision through whatever dirt, sweat, or grime happened to be present. The blade would slice through unwashed skin, carrying surface contaminants directly into the bloodstream and creating an immediate pathway for infection. The blood was collected in bowls, basins, or other containers that had been used for multiple purposes, and were rarely cleaned adequately between uses. These containers might have previously held food, water, animal blood, or even human waste. The same bowl used to collect blood from a diseased patient might be used immediately afterward for the next patient, creating a direct mechanism for disease transmission that medieval practitioners were completely unaware of. The amount of blood removed during a typical bloodletting session would shock modern medical professionals. Physicians would often remove a pint or more of blood from patients who were already weakened by illness, believing that the more blood they removed, the more effective the treatment would be. Patients would be bled repeatedly over the course of their illness, sometimes daily, until they were so weakened by blood loss that they died from the treatment rather than the original disease. Medieval medical texts provide detailed instructions about when and how to perform bloodletting, but they contain no mention of cleanliness, sterilization, or infection prevention. Physicians were taught to identify the proper veins to open the appropriate times of day and seasons of the year for bleeding, and the correct amounts of blood to remove based on the patient's age, constitution, and illness. But they received no training in preventing contamination or recognizing the signs of infection that inevitably resulted from these unsanitary procedures. The tools used alongside bloodletting were equally contaminated and dangerous. Cupping glasses used to create suction over small incisions to draw out blood were rarely cleaned between patients. These glass or metal cups would be heated over open flames to create a vacuum, but the heating process wasn't sufficient to sterilize them, and they would often contain residue from previous patients. Scarificators, devices with multiple small blades used to make numerous shallow cuts simultaneously, would become clogged with dried blood and skin fragments, creating perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and other pathogens. Leeches, when they were used for bloodletting, presented their own unique hygiene challenges. Medieval physicians kept leeches in containers of stagnant water that might be changed infrequently, if at all. The same leeches would be used on multiple patients, and they could carry diseases from one person to another through their bite. After feeding, leeches were often reused immediately on other patients, creating a direct pathway for blood-borne disease transmission that medieval practitioners never recognized. The aftermath of bloodletting was managed with the same lack of sanitary awareness that characterized the procedure itself. The wounds created by bloodletting were often left open to continue draining, or they might be covered with dirty cloth bandages that had been used on other patients. These bandages were rarely washed or sterilized, and they would often stick to the wounds, requiring painful removal that would reopen the cuts and create fresh opportunities for infection. Patients who survived the immediate effects of bloodletting often developed serious infections that medieval physicians attributed to other causes. The red, swollen, pus-filled wounds that resulted from contaminated bloodletting procedures were seen as signs that the treatment was working to draw out the bad humors from the body, rather than as evidence of dangerous bacterial infection. Physicians would often perform additional bloodletting to treat these infections, creating a cycle of contamination and illness that could continue until the patient died. The social setting of bloodletting added another layer of unsanitary horror to the practice. Bloodletting was often performed in public spaces, barbershops, market squares, or the patient's home where crowds of onlookers would gather to watch the procedure. These spectators would crowd around the patient, breathing on open wounds, touching contaminated instruments, and contributing their own unwashed bodies to an already unsanitary environment. The barber surgeon might wipe his bloody hands on his apron or clothing, then touch other people or objects in the crowd, spreading contamination throughout the gathered audience. The economic aspects of bloodletting created incentives for even more unsanitary practices. Barber surgeons were typically paid per procedure, which encouraged them to work quickly and see as many patients as possible in a single day. This economic pressure meant that time-consuming activities like cleaning instruments or washing hands between patients were seen as wasteful luxuries that reduced profitability. The same instruments might be used on dozens of patients in a single day without any cleaning whatsoever. Medieval physicians who practiced bloodletting were often the most educated and respected members of their communities. Yet they had no understanding of the microscopic world of bacteria and infection that made their treatments so dangerous. They believed they were practicing the most advanced and effective medicine available. Following principles that had been handed down from ancient Greek and Roman physicians and refined by generations of medieval scholars, a complete disconnect between their good intentions and the horrifying reality of their unsanitary practices makes medieval medical hygiene one of the most disturbing aspects of life in that era. The surgical procedures performed in medieval Europe represent perhaps the most nightmarish aspect of medieval medical practice, combining the horror of operations performed without anesthesia with the added terror of complete ignorance about infection control and sterilization. Imagine lying conscious on a blood-stained wooden table while a barber surgeon approaches you with rusted, unwashed instruments that have been used on countless other patients, knowing that your only pain relief might be a cup of wine or a leather bit to clamp between your teeth to prevent you from biting off your own tongue in agony. Medieval surgery was typically performed by barber surgeons, men who combined the trades of hair cutting, tooth extraction, and surgical procedures in a profession that required no formal medical training and little understanding of human anatomy. These practitioners learned their skills through apprenticeship, observing and assisting other barber surgeons in procedures that were often more butchery than medicine. Their workshops were typically small, cramped rooms that served multiple functions. They might cut hair in the morning, extract teeth at midday, and perform surgery in the evening, all in the same space with the same unwashed tools. The surgical instruments used in medieval procedures would horrify any modern medical professional. Knives, saws, forceps, and other tools were typically made of iron or crude steel that would rust and corrode with use. These instruments were never sterilized in any way that would eliminate bacteria or other pathogens. At best, they might be wiped clean with a dirty cloth or rinsed in water that had been used for other purposes. More commonly, they were used repeatedly without any cleaning at all, accumulating layers of dried blood, tissue fragments, and whatever diseases previous patients might have carried. The saw used for amputations, one of the most common surgical procedures in medieval times, was often the same saw used for cutting wood or other materials around the workshop. These saws had coarse, irregular teeth that would tear and shred flesh rather than making clean cuts, creating jagged wounds that were virtually impossible to heal properly. The handles of these saws were made of wood that would absorb blood and other fluids, creating permanent reservoirs of contamination that could never be adequately cleaned. Surgical procedures were performed in conditions that were appallingly unsanitary even by medieval standards. The operating surface might be a kitchen table, a workbench, or even the floor, covered with whatever cloth or leather was available. These surfaces were never sterilized and were often contaminated with the residue of previous procedures, food, preparation, or other activities. The patient would be placed on these contaminated surfaces while their open wounds were exposed to every pathogen present in the environment. The absence of anesthesia meant that patients had to be physically restrained during surgery, often by assistants whose hands were as dirty as those of the surgeon. These restraints ropes, leather straps, or simply the hands of strong men would come into direct contact with open wounds, introducing additional contamination from whatever these materials had previously touched. Patients would thrash and struggle during the procedure, causing their wounds to tear and bleed more profusely, while also grinding dirt and debris from the restraints deeper into their open flesh. Medieval surgeons had no understanding of the importance of washing their hands before procedures. Their hands might carry the accumulated filth of their daily activities and more waste from tending livestock, human excrement from emptying chamber pots, rotting food from meal preparation, or the dried blood and pus from previous surgical procedures. These contaminated hands would probe open wounds, handle internal organs, and manipulate surgical instruments, spreading infection throughout the patient's body with every touch. The clothing worn by medieval surgeons during procedures was equally contaminated. They typically wore their everyday clothes, wool tunics, leather aprons, or whatever garments they happened to have on which might be stained with blood, food, animal waste, and various other substances. These clothes were rarely washed and never sterilized, so they served as repositories of infection that would be transferred to every patient the surgeon treated. The leather aprons commonly worn by barber surgeons were particularly problematic, as leather is porous and absorbs fluids readily, creating permanent bacterial colonies that could never be eliminated. Common surgical procedures included tooth extraction, cataract surgery, kidney stone removal, and amputation of limbs damaged by injury or disease. Each of these procedures involved opening the body and exposing internal tissues to the contaminated environment of the medieval surgical workshop. Tooth extraction, perhaps the most frequently performed surgical procedure, was done with crude weed iron forceps that would often break teeth rather than extracting them cleanly, leaving infected fragments embedded in the patient's jaw. The same forceps might be used on dozens of patients in a single day without any cleaning, spreading oral infections and diseases from person to person. Cataract surgery, performed by inserting a sharp needle into the eye to dislodge the clouded lens, was done with instruments that had been used for multiple purposes and were contaminated with THA. Ruby kiss were ruby. Were kiss, only ruby kiss has the luxurious texture that really sounds well served. And levs, I live. And levs was a rich, long-lasting color. Word sles was done with space silich unclass. Where silla wav, may where silla ma. Where soles, we sound to see, we pews. Where's it say by my relas, by KF, res apid, my Billy Sillas, guy biberi up, not we select a cabman, we saw it. Be to call it, beats I guess it's a we say, leave me quick, he said be laps it, tick, get up, I get those it, tick, it's to say that's it go like, whatever pathogens they had previously encountered. The surgeon would probe inside the patient's eye with these dirty instruments, often causing additional damage to the delicate structures of the eye, while introducing infections that would lead to blindness or death. Amputation procedures were particularly horrifying, involving the use of saws, knives, and cauterizing irons that had never been sterilized. The surgeon would cut through skin, muscle, and bone with contaminated instruments, then attempt to stop the bleeding by applying red-hot irons to the raw flesh. These cauterizing irons were heated in the same fires used for cooking, metalworking, or other purposes, and they were never cleaned before being applied to open wounds. The result was not only excruciating pain for the patient, but also the introduction of additional contaminants from whatever had previously been in contact with the cauterizing instruments. The postoperative care provided to surgical patients was as unsanitary as the procedures themselves. Wounds were typically dressed with whatever cloth was available off dirty rags that had been used for other purposes, strips torn from unwashed clothing, or bandages that had been used on previous patients and never properly cleaned. These dressings would stick to the wounds as they dried, requiring painful removal that would reopen the cuts and provide fresh opportunities for infection. Medieval surgeons had no understanding of the importance of wound care or infection prevention. They would examine healing wounds with the same unwashed hands they used for everything else, probing and manipulating the injured tissue in ways that introduced new bacteria and delayed healing. Pus-filled wounds were seen as a positive sign that the body was expelling bad humors, rather than as evidence of dangerous bacterial infection that required immediate attention. The survival rate for medieval surgery was appallingly low, with most patients dying not from their original condition, but from the infections and complications that resulted from unsanitary surgical procedures. Those who did survive often suffered from chronic infections, permanent disabilities, and ongoing health problems that were direct results of the contaminated conditions under which their surgery was performed. The irony is that many patients who underwent medieval surgery would have been better off receiving no treatment at all, as their natural healing processes were often more effective than the contaminated interventions of medieval surgeons. Medieval surgical texts, written by the most learned physicians of the time, contain detailed instructions about surgical techniques and procedures, but they make no mention of cleanliness, sterilization, or infection prevention. These texts were considered the pinnacle of medical knowledge, yet they advocated practices that were essentially systematic methods of introducing life-threatening infections into vulnerable patients. The complete disconnect between the flexing intellectual sophistication of these medical texts and their ignorance of basic sanitary principles represents one of the most tragic aspects of medieval medical practice. The very act of healing in medieval times often became a mechanism for spreading disease. As physicians and healers moved from patient to patient carrying infections on their hands, instruments, and clothing in ways that would make modern medical professionals recoil in horror. The medieval healer, whether a trained physician, a local wise woman, or a traveling quack, was often unknowingly one of the most dangerous people a sick person could encounter, transforming what should have been therapeutic interventions into deadly encounters with contamination and disease. Medieval physicians prided themselves on their diagnostic skills, which often involved extensive physical examination of patients, using techniques that seem appallingly unsanitary by modern standards. A physician would examine multiple patients in a single day, moving from house to house or seeing a succession of patients in his own chambers, using the same unwashed hands to probe, palpate, and examine each person. These hands might have just examined a patient with plague, leprosy, or other contagious diseases, then immediately move on to examine a patient with a minor ailment, effectively spreading serious infections to people who might otherwise have recovered completely. The diagnostics process itself was a festival of contamination. Physicians would examine bodily fluids, urine, blood, sputum, and feces using their bare hands, sometimes even tasting these substances to determine their properties and diagnose illness. They believed that the color, consistency, taste, and smell of bodily fluids provided crucial diagnostic information, so they would handle these substances directly, then move on to examine other patients without washing their hands. A physician might taste the urine of a diabetic patient, then immediately examine the throat of a child with a respiratory infection, spreading whatever pathogens were present in the urine to the child's mucous membranes. Medical instruments used for diagnosis and treatment were shared between patients without any sterilization or cleaning. Thermometers didn't exist, so physicians would assess fever by placing their hands on multiple patients' foreheads in succession. Stethoscopes hadn't been invented, so chest examination involved placing the physician's ear directly against the patient's chest, potentially transferring respiratory infections from one patient to another. Tongue depressors were typically wooden, sticks or metal implements that were used on patient after patient without cleaning, spreading oral infections and diseases throughout the physician's practice. The apothecary shops where medicines were prepared and dispensed were centers of contamination that would horrify modern pharmacists. These establishments typically consisted of a single room where the apothecary would prepare medicines, examine patients, and conduct other business activities. The same surfaces used for grinding medicines might also be used for food preparation, examination of patients, or storage of various materials. Mortar and pestles used to prepare medicines were rarely cleaned between different preparations, so traces of one medicine would contaminate the next, creating unpredictable and potentially dangerous drug interactions. Medieval medicines themselves were often contaminated during preparation and storage. Herbal remedies were prepared using water that might be contaminated with human or animal waste, and they were stored in containers that had been used for other purposes without adequate cleaning. Animal-based medicines ground bones, organ extracts. Blood preparations were prepared using animals that might have been diseased. And the preparation process offered numerous opportunities for bacterial contamination. These medicines were often stored for long periods without refrigeration, allowing dangerous bacteria to multiply and creating potentially lethal preparations that were administered to vulnerable patients. The practice of pulse diagnosis, considered one of the most sophisticated diagnostic techniques available to medieval physicians, involved the physician grasping the patient's wrist or other pulse points with unwashed hands. Since physicians would examine multiple patients in succession, each pulse examination became an opportunity for cross-contamination. A physician might examine the pulse of a patient with a skin infection, then immediately grasp the wrist of another patient, transferring the infection through. Direct skin contact, wound examination, and treatment were particularly dangerous aspects of medieval medical practice. Physicians would probe open wounds with their fingers, examining the depth, texture, and drainage of injuries using direct tactile exploration. These same fingers might have just examined other wounds, handled contaminated instruments, or been in contact with various bodily fluids. So each wound examination introduced new bacteria and contaminants into what might have been relatively clean injuries. The practice of laudable pus, the belief that pus formation was a positive sign of healing, meant that physicians would actually encourage infection in wounds, believing that the presence of infected material indicated successful treatment. The medieval practice of bedside manner involved physical contact that would violate every modern protocol for infection control. Physicians would comfort patients by holding their hands, touching their faces, or embracing them, then move on to other patients carrying whatever pathogens they had picked up. They might adjust patients' bedding, help them change position, or assist with personal care activities, all with the same unwashed hands they used for medical examinations. This compassionate physical contact, while emotionally beneficial to patients, created direct pathways for disease transmission that could spread infections throughout entire communities. Hospital settings, when they existed, amplified these contamination problems exponentially. Medieval hospitals were typically religious institutions that housed dozens or hundreds of patients in large shared wards where diseases could spread rapidly through airborne transmission, shared facilities, and cross-contamination from caregivers. The same physicians and attendants would move from bed to bed throughout these wards, examining and treating patients with a wide variety of conditions without any attempt to prevent cross-contamination. A physician might treat a patient with plague in the morning, then spend the afternoon caring for surgical patients, maternity cases, and individuals with minor ailments, effectively spreading the most serious diseases to the most vulnerable populations. The religious context of much medieval healing added another layer of contamination risk. Many healing practices involved the use of religious relics, bones, cloth, or other objects that were believed to possess miraculous healing powers. These relics were touched by countless pilgrims and patients, accumulating layers of contamination from diseased hands and contaminated with whatever pathogens the previous users might have carried. The same relic might be applied to infected wounds, held by patients with contagious diseases, and kissed by individuals with respiratory infections, creating concentrated repositories of multiple diseases that were then shared with subsequent patients seeking healing. Medical education, such as it existed in medieval times, actually perpetuated these dangerous practices by teaching them as proper medical technique. Medical students learned to examine patients using the same contaminated methods employed by their teachers, and they were taught that physical contact and direct examination of bodily fluids were essential components of proper medical practice. The most prestigious medical schools of the medieval period produced physicians who were trained in systematic methods of spreading disease, while believing they were practicing the most advanced healing arts available. The economic structure of Medieval medical practice created incentives for behaviors that increased contamination risks. Physicians were typically paid per visit or per patient, which encouraged them to see as many patients as possible in a single day. This economic pressure meant that time-consuming activities like hand washing, instrument cleaning, or changing contaminated clothing were seen as wasteful luxuries that reduced profitability. A successful physician was one who could examine and treat large numbers of patients quickly, not one who took time for sanitary precautions that had no apparent benefit in an age. Before germ theory, the irony of medieval medical practice is that the most caring, dedicated, and skilled healers were often the most dangerous to their patients. A physician who worked tirelessly to help the sick, seeing patient after patient and offering comfort and treatment to all who sought his help, was also the person most likely to spread diseases throughout the community. The very qualities that made someone an admirable healer in medieval times: compassion, dedication, willingness to have physical contact with the sick were also the qualities that made them effective vectors for disease transmission. Imagine approaching what medieval people euphemistically called a garderobe or privy chamber. Not the private, sanitized bathroom experience you know today, but a crude stone alcove jutting out from a castle wall where human waste dropped directly through an opening into the moat, courtyard, or cliff face below, creating a nightmare of sanitation that would make modern sewage treatment seem like a miracle of civilization. The very name garderobe reveals the medieval mindset about waste management. It literally means wardrobe in French, because people would hang their most expensive clothes in these reeking chambers, believing that the ammonia fumes from human waste would kill moths and other insects that might damage valuable fabrics. The construction of a medieval garderobe was an exercise in primitive engineering that prioritized convenience over sanitation in ways that would horrify modern architects and public health officials. These toilet chambers were typically built into the thick walls of castles and fortified buildings, accessible through narrow passages that were designed more for privacy than for hygiene. The toilet itself consisted of a stone bench with a rectangular or keyhole-shaped opening carved into it, positioned over a vertical shaft that dropped straight down through the wall, and discharged its contents wherever gravity and architectural convenience dictated. The horror of using a medieval garderobe began the moment you entered the small, cramped chamber. The smell was overwhelming. EHA's concentrated assault of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and the complex organic odors of decomposing human waste that had been accumulating in the shaft below for weeks, months, or even years. This wasn't the quick, ventilated experience of a modern bathroom, but rather an extended period spent in a stone chamber that functioned essentially as a concentrated cesspit with a seat on top. The ammonia fumes were so strong that they would burn your eyes and throat, while the lack of ventilation meant that these toxic gases had nowhere to go except into the user's lungs. The waste management system, if it can be called a system at all, was based on the simple principle of gravity and the hope that whatever was deposited would somehow decompose or be washed away by rain. In castles built near rivers or on cliff tops, the garderobe shafts would discharge directly into the water or over the edge, creating environmental contamination that affected everything downstream. The famous Warwick Castle's garderobe discharged directly into the River Avon, while many coastal castles simply dropped their waste over cliff faces, where it would accumulate on the rocks below and be slowly washed away by tides. For castles not blessed with convenient rivers or cliffs, waste management became even more revolting. The garderobe shafts would empty into courtyards, moats, or specially constructed cesspits that would fill up over time and require periodic emptying by unfortunate workers known as gong farmers or night soil men. These laborers had to climb down into the accumulated waste, sometimes reaching depths of several feet, and manually remove the decomposed human waste using buckets. shovels, and their bare hands. The work was so foul and dangerous that gong farmers were typically required to work only at night, were paid premium wages for their disgusting labor, and often lived as social outcasts due to the permanent stench that clung to their bodies and clothing. The garderobe shafts themselves were architectural nightmares that created health hazards extending far beyond the immediate toilet area. These stone-lined chutes, sometimes extending down several stories, became breeding grounds for rats, insects, and disease-carrying pests that could travel up and down the shafts, spreading contamination throughout the castle. The stone walls of the shafts would become coated with layers of waste material that could never be adequately cleaned, creating permanent bacterial colonies that would contaminate anything that came into contact with them. Rainwater entering the shafts would mix with the waste to create a toxic soup that could overflow back into the castle during heavy storms. The multi-story nature of many medieval castles created particularly revolting garderobe arrangements, where multiple toilets were stacked vertically, all emptying into the same shaft. Users of upper-level garderobes had to hope that no one was using the facilities below them, as waste from above would cascade down past the lower openings, potentially splashing onto anyone unfortunate enough to be seated there. The architectural plans of medieval castles show garderobe towers with 3, 4, or even 5 toilets stacked one above another, creating vertical columns of human waste that would accumulate and decompose over months or years. The materials used for medieval toilet paper. When any cleaning materials were used at all would shock modern sensibilities and create additional health hazards. Wealthy individuals might use soft cloth or even silk for cleaning, but these materials were expensive luxuries that most people couldn't afford. More commonly, people used whatever was available: hay, straw, leaves, moss, smooth stones, or even corn cobs. These materials were often dirty before use and could introduce additional bacteria and parasites into sensitive body areas. The hay and straw used for toilet paper were the same materials used for animal bedding, meaning they were often contaminated with animal waste and whatever parasites the livestock might carry. Some medieval toilets featured crude washing facilities basins of water or primitive bidets, but these were luxury items available only to the wealthy, and the water used for cleaning was rarely changed between users. The same basin of water might serve dozens of people before being replaced, creating a concentrated bacterial solution that was more likely to spread infection than prevent it. The water was typically cold, unfiltered, and drawn from whatever source was convenient, which might include the same rivers or wells that were being replaced, contaminated by waste discharge from other parts of the castle. The seasonal variations in garderobe usage created additional horrors that medieval people had to endure. In winter, the stone seats would be freezing cold, and users would have to expose themselves to frigid temperatures in unheated chambers. The waste in the shafts would freeze solid, creating ice dams that would cause backups and overflows when warmer weather returned. In summer, the heat would intensify the odors and accelerate decomposition, creating toxic gas buildups that could actually be dangerous to breathe. Flies and other insects would swarm around the garderobe openings, carrying bacteria and parasites between the waste areas and food preparation spaces. The strategic military implications of garderobe placement created some of the most revolting aspects of medieval siege warfare. Enemy forces would sometimes try to infiltrate castles by climbing up the waste shafts, a tactic that required soldiers to literally swim through accumulated human waste to reach the interior of the fortress. Defenders would sometimes dump additional waste, boiling water, or other defensive materials down the garderobe shafts to repel these attacks. The famous siege of Chateau Galliard in 1204 was partly successful because attackers managed to climb through a garderobe shaft, emerging inside the castle covered in human waste but gaining access that allowed them to open the gates for their army. The social etiquette surrounding garderobe use reveals the complex relationship medieval people had with these necessary but revolting facilities. Privacy was minimal. Many garderobes had no doors, and the sound of waste dropping down the shaft could be heard throughout nearby chambers. Users had to coordinate their visits to avoid the embarrassment and danger of waste from upper levels, splashing on lower users. The wealthy might employ servants to clean the stone seats before use, but this cleaning typically involved only wiping with cloths that were rarely washed and were used for multiple people. The health consequences of medieval garderobe systems were catastrophic, though not understood at the time. The direct contamination of water supplies through waste discharge created cholera, dysentery, and typhoid epidemics that could kill hundreds of people. The rats and insects that thrived in garderobe shafts carried diseases throughout the castle and surrounding areas. The toxic gases produced by decomposing waste could cause respiratory problems, skin irritation, and other immediate health effects. The lack of proper cleaning and the primitive materials used for personal hygiene created urinary tract infections, parasitic infestations, and other conditions that could be debilitating or fatal in an age without effective medical treatment. In the darkest corners of medieval society lived a group of people whose very existence reveals the desperate lengths to which communities would go to manage the endless production of human waste in an age without modern sanitation systems. These were the gong farmers, also known as night soil men, whose profession was so revolting and socially stigmatizing that they were literally required to work only under cover of darkness, hidden from the sight of decent society as they performed the essential but nauseating task of manually removing human waste from cesspits, latrines, and garderobe shafts. The very term gong farmer reveals the medieval mentality about waste management. Gong was a euphemism for privy or toilet, while farmer suggested that these workers were somehow cultivating or harvesting a crop, when in reality they were wallowing in the accumulated excrement of entire communities. The work was so foul that it was regulated by law in many medieval towns and cities, with strict rules about when and how waste removal could be performed. In London, gong farmers were prohibited from working during daylight hours and were required to remove their collected waste outside the city limits before dawn, ensuring that respectable citizens would never have to witness the full horror of medieval waste management. The physical process of gong farming was a nightmare that would challenge the strongest stomach and most determined constitution. Workers would descend into cesspits using crude ladders or ropes, sometimes dropping down into chambers that were 10 or more feet deep and filled with years of accumulated human waste. The consistency of this waste varied from liquid sewage to semi-solid sludge, and workers would often sink up to their waist or even chest in the accumulated filth. They worked by candlelight or torchlight, breathing toxic fumes that could cause unconsciousness or death, while manually scooping waste into buckets that were hauled up by assistants at ground level. The tools used by gong farmers were as primitive as the work itself: shovels, buckets, rakes, and their own hands were the primary implements for moving tons of decomposed human waste. These tools would become permanently contaminated and were often used only for waste removal, as no other work could be performed with implements that had been submerged in human sewage. The buckets used to haul waste to the surface would leak and splash, covering the workers with additional filth and spreading contamination throughout the work area. The ropes and pulleys used to lift the waste buckets would become soaked with sewage and would rot quickly from the constant exposure to corrosive waste materials. The transportation of night soil from collection points to disposal areas created additional horrors for both the workers and the communities they served. Gong farmers would load their collected waste into carts or wagons that would leak as they traveled through the streets, leaving trails of human sewage that would contaminate roads, water supplies, and anything else they encountered. These waste Carts were pulled by horses or oxen that would also become contaminated, and the animals would spread the waste further through their hooves and bodies. The disposal sites, typically agricultural fields outside the city, would become toxic wastelands where crops would be fertilized with raw human sewage, creating food contamination that could spread disease throughout the entire food supply. The social status of gong farmers was so low that they were often prohibited from living within city limits and were required to identify themselves with distinctive clothing or badges that warned others of their profession. They were excluded from guilds, churches, and most social institutions, creating a hereditary caste of waste workers who passed their revolting profession from father to son because no other opportunities were available to them. The permanent stench that clung to gong farmers made them unwelcome in most social situations, and they often lived in isolated communities with others who worked in equally contaminated professions. Butchers and others whose work involved dealing with organic waste. The health risks faced by gong farmers were extreme and often fatal. Exposure to toxic gases produced by decomposing waste could cause immediate death by asphyxiation or poisoning. Many gong farmers died while working in cesspits when they were overcome by methane, hydrogen sulfide, or other deadly gases that accumulated in enclosed spaces. Those who survived the immediate dangers of their work often suffered from chronic respiratory problems, skin diseases, and digestive disorders caused by constant exposure to bacterial contamination. The mortality rate among gong farmers was significantly higher than the general population, and few survived to old age in their profession. The economic aspects of night soil work reveal the desperate nature of medieval waste management. Gong farmers were typically paid premium wages for their revolting labor, wages that had to be high enough to compensate for the social stigma and health risks involved. However, these high wages came with significant costs, as gong farmers had to provide their own tools, transportation, and disposal services. They were also subject to fines and penalties if they violated the strict regulations governing their work, such as working during daylight hours or disposing of waste in prohibited locations. The seasonal nature of the work meant that income was irregular, as waste removal was often impossible during winter months when cesspits would freeze solid. The disposal of night soil created environmental contamination on a scale that would be considered criminal by modern standards. The raw human waste collected by gong farmers was typically sold to farmers as fertilizer. But this night soil was never composted or treated to kill parasites and disease-causing organisms. Agricultural fields would be flooded with raw sewage that would contaminate crops, water supplies, and livestock. The runoff from these contaminated fields would pollute rivers and streams, spreading disease throughout entire watersheds. The practice of using fresh human waste as fertilizer created cycles of disease transmission that could affect entire populations through contaminated food and water. The working conditions for gong farmers were made even more horrific by the need to work in cramped, enclosed spaces where toxic gases could accumulate to deadly levels. Cesspits were often built with minimal ventilation, and the decomposition process would consume oxygen while producing carbon dioxide, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. Workers would frequently collapse while working in these oxygen-depleted environments, and their fellow workers would often be overcome by the same gases when they attempted rescues. The primitive safety equipment available to medieval workers, essentially nothing more than cloths over their face, says provided no protection against these deadly atmospheric conditions. The seasonal cycles of waste accumulation created periods of particularly intensive and dangerous work for gong farmers. Spring cleaning of cesspits that had been accumulating waste throughout the winter would involve removing months of frozen and decomposed material that had reached toxic concentrations. Summer work was complicated by intense odors and rapid decomposition that would create dangerous gas buildups. Autumn waste removal had to be completed before winter freezing made the work impossible. These seasonal pressures meant that gong farmers would often work continuously for days or weeks at a time, increasing their exposure to toxic materials and deadly working conditions. The legal framework surrounding night soil work reveals the complex relationship medieval society had with waste management. While the work was essential for public health, it was also seen as so degrading that it required extensive regulation to ensure it was performed without offending social sensibilities. Law specified exactly when, where, and how waste removal could be performed, with severe penalties for violations. The workers themselves were subject to discriminatory laws that restricted their movement, housing, and social interactions. These legal restrictions created a system of institutional oppression that trapped gong farmers and their families in hereditary cycles of poverty and social exclusion. The legacy of medieval night soil management can be seen in the persistent social stigma attached to sanitation work and the ongoing challenges of waste management in developing countries where modern sewage treatment is not available. The heroic efforts of gong farmers to maintain some semblance of sanitation in impossible conditions demonstrate both the resilience of human beings faced with necessity and the desperate lengths to which people will go to maintain basic public health. Their story is a reminder of how much modern sanitation systems contribute to public health and social well-being, and how quickly our comfortable modern world could revert to the revolting realities of medieval waste management if these systems were to fail. The streets of medieval towns and cities were transformed into vast, open-air toilets where human waste, animal excrement, rotting food, and industrial waste combined to create an urban environment so contaminated and foul that it would be literally unlivable by modern standards. Walking through a typical medieval city meant navigating rivers of sewage, piles of decomposing garbage, and clouds of toxic gases that rose from the accumulated filth of thousands of people. Living in cramped conditions without any organized system of waste management, the practice of throwing waste directly into the street was so common in medieval times that it was regulated by law rather than prohibited entirely. Many cities had ordinances requiring people to shout "Gardes low," "Watch out for the water," before emptying chamber pots from upper-story windows, giving pedestrians a brief moment to dodge the cascade of human waste that was about to rain down on them. This warning system, rather than preventing the practice, simply institutionalized it, acknowledging that street contamination was an accepted part of urban life. The phrase evolved into the English "gardy loo" and later contributed to the euphemistic term "loo for toilet," creating a linguistic legacy of medieval waste management practices. The composition of street waste was a nightmarish mixture that included not only human excrement but also animal waste from horses, pigs, cattle, and chickens that roamed freely through urban areas. Butchers would discard animal entrails, blood, and rotting meat directly into the streets. Tanners would dump the toxic chemicals and decomposing animal matter used in leather processing. Brewers and bakers would contribute organic waste from their industries. Households would throw out spoiled food, dead rats, and the contents of chamber pots. All of this waste would accumulate in the streets, creating a toxic soup that would be spread throughout the city by foot traffic, cartwheels, and the hooves of animals. The drainage systems in medieval cities, where they existed at all, were primitive channels that were more likely to spread contamination than contain it. Open gutters running down the center or sides of streets would carry wastewater, sewage, and debris, but these channels would frequently clog with garbage and overflow during storms, flooding the streets with contaminated water. The gutters themselves would become breeding grounds for rats, insects, and disease-carrying pests that would multiply in the warm, nutrient-rich environment of decomposing organic waste. In winter, these gutters would freeze, creating ice dams that would cause waste to back up and accumulate in even more concentrated and toxic pools. The absence of organized garbage collection meant that waste disposal was left to individual initiative, and natural decomposition processes that were completely inadequate for the volume of waste produced by dense urban populations. People would simply throw their garbage into the streets and hope that rain, scavenging animals, or the passage of time would somehow make it disappear. Organic waste would rot in place, creating putrid odors and attracting flies, rats, and other pests. Non-organic waste pottery shards, metal scraps, broken tools would accumulate indefinitely, creating hazardous debris that could cause injuries and impede street traffic. The contamination of water supplies through street waste created public health disasters that could kill hundreds or thousands of people in single outbreaks of disease. Wells and springs that provided drinking water were often located close to streets where waste accumulated, and the groundwater would become contaminated with bacteria from human and animal excrement. Rivers that flowed through cities would become so polluted with sewage and industrial waste that they were essentially open sewers. Yet people continued to use this contaminated water for drinking, cooking, and bathing because no alternatives were available. The Thames in London became so polluted that it was described as a river of death. Yet it remained the primary water source for much of the city's population. Market areas where food was sold and prepared were particularly horrifying examples of medieval sanitation failures. Vendors would set up their stalls directly in streets that were contaminated with human and animal waste, spreading that contamination to the food they were selling. Butchers would slaughter animals in the streets, allowing blood and entrails to flow into the general waste stream. Fish sellers would dispose of spoiled fish and fish waste directly onto the ground where people walked and shopped. Bread bakers would work in areas where flour could become contaminated with airborne particles from decomposing waste. The contamination of food supplies through poor sanitation created constant risks of food poisoning, intestinal parasites, and other digestive diseases. The industrial activities that took place in medieval cities added toxic chemicals and heavy metals to the already dangerous mixture of organic waste in the streets. Metalworkers would dump slag, acids, and other chemical wastes. Dyers would dispose of toxic dyes and mordants used in textile production. Soap makers would discard lye and animal fats. These industrial wastes would mix with organic sewage too, create chemical combinations that were even more dangerous than either type of waste alone. The runoff from these contaminated streets would pollute water supplies with both biological and chemical contaminants that could cause immediate poisoning as well as long-term health effects. The social implications of living in environments contaminated with human waste were profound and affected every aspect of medieval urban life. The constant presence of sewage odors meant that people became accustomed to smells that would be nauseating to modern sensibilities. Social interactions took place against a background of overwhelming stench that would make normal conversation difficult and unpleasant. The contamination of clothing and shoes from walking through sewage-filled streets meant that people carried waste odors with them wherever they went, spreading contamination into homes, workplaces, and social gatherings. The architecture of medieval cities was adapted to the reality of street contamination in ways that reveal how completely waste management failures had been accepted as normal. Buildings were constructed with ground floors that could be easily cleaned and were often used for activities that could tolerate contamination: animal housing, storage, or workshops. Living spaces were elevated to upper floors to escape the worst of the street-level contamination. But waste thrown from these upper floors would contribute to the very problem people were trying to escape. Windows were kept small and were often covered to prevent waste from being thrown inside, creating dark, poorly ventilated living spaces that had their own health problems. The economic costs of poor sanitation were enormous, though not well understood at the time. Disease outbreaks caused by contaminated water and food would kill significant portions of the population, reducing the workforce and disrupting economic activity. The contamination of trade goods with sewage would make exports less valuable and could damage a city's commercial reputation. The need to constantly replace clothing, shoes, and other items damaged by contact with corrosive waste materials has created additional economic burdens for individuals and families. The social costs of caring for people disabled by diseases caused by poor sanitation created ongoing drains on community resources. The attempts to address urban sanitation problems through regulation and enforcement revealed both the recognition that waste management was a serious problem and the limited tools available to medieval authorities to address it. Cities would pass laws prohibiting certain types of waste disposal, but enforcement was difficult and penalties were often inadequate to change behavior. Some cities attempted to organize waste removal services, but these efforts were usually overwhelmed by the volume of waste and the limited technology available for collection and disposal. The most successful sanitation efforts were often undertaken by religious institutions or wealthy individuals who had the resources to create private waste management systems for their own properties. The environmental damage caused by medieval urban waste management practices extended far beyond the immediate urban areas and affected entire regional ecosystems. Rivers polluted with urban waste would carry contamination for miles downstream, affecting rural communities that had no direct connection to the urban waste production. Agricultural areas that used contaminated water for irrigation would produce crops that carried disease throughout the food supply chain. The accumulation of toxic waste in rivers and lakes would kill fish and other wildlife, disrupting food webs and reducing the availability of protein sources for human consumption. The psychological impact of living in such contaminated environments may have been as significant as the physical health effects: constant exposure to overwhelming odors, visual contamination, and the knowledge that one's environment was literally saturated with human waste must have created stress and anxiety that affected mental health and social relationships. The acceptance of such conditions as normal reveals a kind of learned helplessness that may have inhibited efforts to develop better sanitation systems. The social stratification that allowed wealthy individuals to escape the worst contamination while poor people were forced to live in the most polluted areas created inequalities that perpetuated the problems and prevented community-wide solutions. Medieval women faced one of the most challenging and disgusting aspects of feminine hygiene that modern women can barely imagine: managing their monthly menstrual periods without any of the products, privacy, or understanding that we take for granted today. The medieval period, with its complete lack of disposable sanitary products, limited access to clean water, and profound ignorance about female reproductive health, transformed the natural process of menstruation into a monthly ordeal of discomfort, embarrassment, and potential health hazards that could quite literally be life-threatening. The materials available to medieval women for managing menstrual flow were limited to whatever natural substances they could find, fashion, or afford, and none of these materials would meet even the most basic standards of modern feminine hygiene. Wealthy women might have access to soft linen rags that could be fashioned into crude, absorbent cloths, but these rags were expensive, difficult to clean, and had to be reused repeatedly throughout a woman's reproductive life. Poor women had to make do with whatever materials were available: rough hemp cloth, wool scraps, or even hay and straw substances that would be uncomfortable, irritating, and potentially dangerous when used in such intimate contact with sensitive body parts. Perhaps the most revolting aspect of medieval menstrual management was the use of sphagnum moss, a natural material that was absorbent but came with horrifying risks that medieval women had no choice but to accept. This bog moss, while naturally antibacterial to some degree, had to be gathered from swamps and wetlands where it was exposed to stagnant water, decomposing organic matter, and whatever parasites and bacteria thrived in those environments. Women would stuff this moss into linen pouches or simply use it directly against their bodies, creating intimate contact with materials that could carry deadly infections, parasitic worms, and toxic bacteria directly into their reproductive systems. The process of preparing and using menstrual rags was a monthly ritual of contamination and discomfort that reveals the desperate lengths to which medieval women went to maintain some semblance of hygiene during their periods. The linen rags used for menstrual absorption would be folded, twisted, or sewn into crude pad-like shapes that were held in place by belts, ties, or simply tucked into undergarments. These makeshift sanitary devices were bulky, uncomfortable, and prone to shifting during normal activities, creating constant anxiety about leakage and exposure. The absorbency was minimal compared to modern products, meaning that women had to change their makeshift pads frequently throughout the day. It's a process that required privacy that was often unavailable in the cramped living conditions of medieval life. The washing and reuse of menstrual cloths created ongoing hygiene challenges that could persist throughout a woman's entire reproductive life. After use, the blood-soaked rags had to be washed in cold water. Hot water would set the blood stains permanently using harsh soaps that could irritate sensitive skin when the cloths were reused. The washing process often took place in shared water sources or communal washing areas where other women might be cleaning similar materials, creating opportunities for cross-contamination and the spread of reproductive tract infections. The drying process was equally problematic, as the cloths had to be hung where they could air dry completely. But social taboos around menstruation meant that these cloths often had to be dried in hidden locations, where they might not dry thoroughly, creating damp conditions, perfect for bacterial and fungal growth. Medieval medical understanding of menstruation, based on the theory of the four humors, was so fundamentally wrong that it actually created additional health risks for women. Physicians believed that menstrual blood was a toxic substance that needed to be expelled from the body to maintain health, and they would often prescribe treatments designed to increase menstrual flow rather than manage it. These treatments might include herbal preparations that could cause excessive bleeding, physical manipulations that could damage reproductive organs, or dietary restrictions that could lead to malnutrition during an already physically demanding time of the month. The social stigma and religious taboos surrounding menstruation in medieval times created additional layers of difficulty for women trying to manage their periods with dignity and privacy. Menstruating women were often considered ritually unclean and were prohibited from participating in religious services, preparing food, or engaging in normal social activities. These restrictions meant that women had to find ways to conceal their menstrual status while dealing with the physical challenges of managing their periods with inadequate materials and limited privacy. The shame associated with menstruation meant that mothers often failed to adequately prepare their daughters for menarche, leaving young women to figure out menstrual management through trial and error during what was already a confusing and frightening time of physical development. The lack of understanding about reproductive anatomy meant that medieval women had no knowledge of the connection between menstrual hygiene and reproductive health, leading to practices that would increase the risk of serious infections. Might use the same unwashed rags throughout their entire menstrual period, allowing bacteria to multiply in the warm, moist environment created by menstrual blood. They might pack moss or other materials too tightly into their bodies, creating conditions that could lead to toxic shock or other life-threatening infections. The primitive materials used for menstrual management could shed fibers or particles that could remain in the reproductive tract, causing irritation, infection, or other complications that could affect fertility or overall health. The seasonal challenges of medieval menstruation added additional layers of difficulty to an already challenging situation. Winter periods had to be managed in unheated buildings where women would be reluctant to remove clothing for hygiene maintenance, leading to extended periods of contact with contaminated materials. Summer heat would intensify odors and increase the risk of bacterial growth in menstrual materials. Rainy seasons would make it difficult to dry reusable cloths adequately, forcing women to use damp materials that could cause skin irritation and fungal infections. Travel during menstruation was particularly challenging, as women would have to carry their limited supply of menstrual materials with them and find ways to clean and dry them without access to familiar facilities or privacy. The dietary restrictions and food taboos that surrounded menstruation in medieval times often left women malnourished during the very time when their bodies needed additional nutrition to support the physical demands of menstruation. Religious and cultural beliefs might prohibit menstruating women from consuming certain foods, drinking wine, or eating with others, creating nutritional deficiencies that could worsen menstrual symptoms and compromise overall health. The belief that menstrual blood was toxic led to dietary recommendations that were supposed to help the body expel this poison. But these diets were often inadequate to support the increased nutritional needs of menstruating women. The reproductive health consequences of poor menstrual hygiene in medieval times were severe and often fatal, though the connection between hygiene and health was not understood at the time. Repeated infections of the reproductive tract could lead to chronic pelvic inflammatory disease, which could cause infertility, chronic pain, and life-threatening complications during pregnancy and childbirth. The use of contaminated materials for menstrual management could introduce parasites and bacteria that could cause systemic infections that might not manifest symptoms for weeks or months after the initial contamination. The social isolation and stress associated with menstruation could contribute to mental health problems that were not recognized or treated in medieval medical practice. The intimate reality of medieval life included a constant battle against parasites that would make modern people physically ill to contemplate lives, fleas, bedbugs, and various worms that lived on and in the human body, creating conditions of personal infestation that were so universal that they were simply accepted as a normal part of existence. Medieval people lived in such close contact with these parasites that they developed entire vocabularies, social customs, and even fashions designed around managing what would be considered today a medical emergency, requiring immediate professional treatment. Body lice were perhaps the most universally despised yet inescapable companions of medieval life, thriving in the warm, rarely washed clothing that people wore continuously for weeks or months at a time. These tiny insects would live and breed in the seams of woolen garments, laying their eggs in the fibers where they would be almost impossible to remove. A single garment could harbor thousands of lice, and the constant itching they caused would drive people to scratch until they created open wounds that could become infected. The lice would feed on human blood multiple times per day, creating a constant drain on the host's health and contributing to anemia, fatigue, and compromised immune function that made people more susceptible to other diseases. The process of delousing was a daily ritual that reveals the extent to which parasitic infestation had become normalized in medieval society. People would systematically search through their clothing and hair, picking off individual lice and crushing them between their fingernails. Practice that was so common, it was considered a normal social activity. Families would delouse each other as a form of grooming and bonding, and lovers would pick lice from each other's hair as an intimate activity. This constant handling of parasites meant that people's hands were regularly contaminated with insect bodies, eggs, and whatever bacteria the lice might carry, spreading contamination to food, personal items, and other people through normal social contact. Fleas presented a different but equally revolting challenge, as they could jump from person to person and from animals to humans, creating networks of parasitic transmission that could spread throughout entire communities. Medieval people shared their living spaces with dogs, cats, pigs, and other animals that served as reservoirs for flea populations, ensuring a constant supply of new parasites ready to infest human hosts. The fleas would bite exposed skin, creating intensely itchy welts that people would scratch raw, often leading to secondary bacterial infections. The constant presence of fleas meant that people never experienced the comfort of uninterrupted sleep, as the parasites would be most active during nighttime hours when they would emerge to feed on sleeping humans. Bedbugs created nighttime horror scenarios that would drive modern people to abandon their homes and seek professional pest control services. But medieval people had no choice but to coexist with these blood-sucking parasites that would emerge from cracks in walls, bed frames, and mattresses to feed on sleeping humans. The bugs would gorge themselves on blood until they became swollen and sluggish, then return to their hiding places to digest their meal and lay eggs. A single bed might harbor hundreds or thousands of bedbugs, and the insects would leave behind characteristic bloodstains, fecal spots, and sweet, musty odors that would permeate sleeping areas. The psychological impact of knowing that parasites were feeding on you while you slept must have created anxiety and sleep disturbances that affected mental health and overall well-being. Head lice were particularly problematic for women, whose long hair provided ideal habitat for these parasites to establish large, thriving populations that could persist for months or years without treatment. Medieval women would develop elaborate hairstyles and head coverings, partly as strategies for managing lice infestations. But these same styles could create warm, humid environments that were even more favorable to parasite populations.
The process
of removing lice from long hair was time-consuming and often ineffective, as the insects and their eggs could hide deep in the hair shaft where they were difficult to detect and remove. The constant presence of lice would cause women to scratch their scalps until they created open wounds that could become infected, leading to serious scalp conditions that could cause permanent hair loss. The social acceptance of parasitic infestation created cultural practices that seem bizarre and revolting to modern sensibilities. Saint Francis of Assisi famously referred to body lice as pearls of poverty and encouraged his followers to welcome these parasites as reminders of their humility and connection to the natural world. Some religious texts suggested that tolerating parasites was a form of spiritual discipline that could bring believers closer to God. The wealthy would sometimes employ servants whose specific job was to catch and kill the lice and fleas that infested their employers' bodies and clothing, creating a professional class of parasite hunters who spent their days handling the intimate infestations of their social superiors. Fashion accessories and jewelry were often designed specifically to address parasite problems, revealing how completely infestations had been integrated into daily life. Wealthy women wore elaborate flea traps, small containers filled with honey or other sticky substances that would attract and trap fleas before they could bite. These devices were often beautifully crafted from precious metals and decorated with gems, transforming parasite control into a fashion statement. Combs were designed with teeth so fine they could catch lice and their eggs, and these combs were considered essential personal accessories that people would carry with them at all times. Special brushes and picks were used to remove parasites from clothing and bedding, and these tools were often passed down through families as valuable inheritances. Intestinal parasites presented internal infestation challenges that were invisible, but potentially deadly. As medieval people regularly consumed contaminated food and water that contained the eggs and larvae of various worms, roundworms, tapeworms, and other intestinal parasites could grow to enormous sizes inside the human digestive system, sometimes reaching lengths of several feet and consuming significant portions of the host's nutrition. These parasites would cause chronic malnutrition, digestive problems, and weakness that could be debilitating or fatal, particularly in children and elderly people whose immune systems were already compromised. The medieval understanding of intestinal parasites was limited to the occasional discovery of worms in vomit or feces, but there was no effective treatment for these infestations. The relationship between poor hygiene and parasitic infestation created vicious cycles that were difficult to break even when people recognized the connection. Lice and fleas would be transferred through shared bedding, clothing, and personal items. So even people who attempted to maintain cleanliness could be reinfested through contact with contaminated objects or other infested people. The social nature of medieval life, with families sharing beds and living in close quarters, meant that parasitic infestations would spread rapidly through entire households. Communal activities like religious services, market gatherings, and social celebrations provided opportunities for parasites to spread throughout entire communities, creating endemic infestations that could persist for generations. The health consequences of chronic parasitic infestation were severe and contributed to the generally poor health and short life expectancy of medieval people. The constant blood loss from feeding parasites could cause anemia and weakness that would make people more susceptible to other diseases. The skin damage caused by scratching could provide entry points for bacterial infections that could become systemic and life-threatening. The stress and sleep disruption caused by parasites could compromise immune function and mental health. The malnutrition caused by intestinal parasites could stunt growth and development in children and contribute to the generally small stature and poor health of medieval populations. The seasonal variations in parasite populations created cyclical challenges that medieval people had to navigate throughout the year. Summer heat would accelerate the reproduction cycles of lice and fleas, creating population explosions that could make infestations particularly severe during the warmest months. Winter conditions would drive parasites to seek warm hiding places in clothing and bedding, concentrating infestations in the very items people depended on for warmth and comfort. Spring cleaning rituals often focused on parasite control, as people would attempt to reduce infestations that had built up over the winter months. But these efforts were often inadequate to eliminate established parasite populations. The experience of giving birth in medieval times was surrounded by such appalling conditions of filth, ignorance, and contamination that it's remarkable any women or babies survived the process at all. Medieval childbirth took place in environments that would violate every modern standard of medical hygiene. Attended by midwives whose hands had never known soap, using instruments that had never been sterilized, and following practices that seemed designed to introduce deadly infections into the most vulnerable moments of a woman's life. The birthing chamber itself was typically a small, poorly ventilated room where the laboring woman would be surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, and the local midwife, all crowding into a space that would become thick with the odors of sweat, blood, amniotic fluid, and whatever other bodily substances the birth process would produce. These rooms were rarely cleaned specifically for the birth, and they might contain the accumulated dirt and debris of normal daily life and mole waste tracked in on shoes, food scraps, ash from cooking fires, and the general filth that characterized medieval domestic spaces. The air would be stale and contaminated, filled with bacteria and other pathogens that could easily enter the woman's body through the various openings created during the birthing process. The midwife who attended medieval births was typically an older woman from the local community who had acquired her skills through experience rather than formal training, and whose understanding of hygiene was limited to the folk beliefs and superstitions of her time. Her hands, which would be intimately involved in the birth process, had never been properly washed and might carry the contamination of her daily activities handling animal waste, preparing food, tending to sick people, or dealing with the waste management challenges of medieval life. These contaminated hands would probe the woman's birth canal, manipulate the position of the baby, and handle the umbilical cord and placenta, introducing bacteria directly into the most sterile environment in the human body. The instruments and materials used in medieval childbirth were crude, dirty, and often dangerous to both mother and child. Knives used to cut the umbilical cord were the same knives used for food preparation, animal slaughter, or other household tasks, and they were never sterilized before use. Threads or strips of cloth used to tie off the umbilical cord were made from whatever materials were available, and were never cleaned or sterilized. Bowls and basins used to catch blood and other birth fluids were often the same containers used for food preparation or waste collection, creating direct pathways for contamination between bodily fluids and the materials that would come into contact with the newborn baby. The position and support provided to laboring women created additional opportunities for contamination and injury. Women typically gave birth in seated or squatting positions, supported by birth stools or chairs that had been used by multiple women over many years and were never adequately cleaned between uses. These birth stools would be stained with blood, amniotic fluid, and other substances from previous births, creating bacterial reservoirs that could infect each new user. The cloth coverings or cushions used on these stools would absorb fluids and become permanent, sources of contamination that could never be adequately cleaned with the limited washing. Techniques available in medieval times. The practices used to assist difficult births were often more dangerous than helpful, involving manual interventions that would introduce massive contamination into the birth canal and uterus. Midwives would reach inside the woman's body with unwashed hands to manipulate the position of the baby, often causing tears and lacerations that would provide entry points for deadly infections. When babies were born in breech or other difficult presentations, midwives would sometimes use crude tools, hooks, forceps, or other instruments to extract the baby, causing severe trauma to both mother and child while introducing contamination deep into the reproductive tract. The immediate care provided to newborn babies was equally contaminated and dangerous. The baby would be wiped clean with whatever cloths were available, often dirty rags that had been used for other purposes, and these cloths might introduce bacteria directly onto the baby's skin and into any small cuts or abrasions caused by the birth process. The baby would then be wrapped in swaddling clothes that had been used for previous babies and were rarely washed adequately between uses. These swaddling clothes would be kept on the baby for days or weeks at a time, creating warm, moist environments perfect for bacterial growth and skin infections. The care of the umbilical cord created particularly dangerous opportunities for infection that could kill newborn babies within days of birth. The cord would be cut with contaminated knives, tied off with dirty threads, and then treated with various folk remedies that were supposed to promote healing but often introduced additional contamination. Common treatments included applying animal dung, herbal pastes, or other organic materials that were teeming with bacteria. The umbilical stump would be covered with dirty cloths and left to heal naturally, often becoming infected and serving as a pathway for bacteria to enter the baby's bloodstream and cause systemic infections that were usually fatal. The management of the placenta and afterbirth created additional health hazards for the new mother. The placenta might be allowed to deliver naturally, or midwives might reach into the uterus with contaminated hands to manually remove it, causing severe trauma and introducing massive bacterial contamination into the most sterile internal environment in the woman's body. The placenta would then be disposed of in ways that could create ongoing contamination buried in the floor of the birthing chamber, thrown into waste pits, or used in various folk remedies that required handling and manipulation of the infected tissue. The postpartum care provided to new mothers was characterized by practices that would increase rather than reduce the risk of infection and complications. Women would be encouraged to remain in bed for extended periods after giving birth, lying in the same contaminated bedding where the birth had taken place and where blood, amniotic fluid, and other bodily substances had soaked into mattresses and blankets that could never be adequately cleaned. The vaginal bleeding that follows childbirth would be managed with the same crude methods used for menstruation: dirty rags, moss, or other absorbent materials that would become breeding grounds for bacteria and could cause serious reproductive tract infections. The dietary restrictions and folk remedies prescribed for new mothers often compromised their health at the very time when good nutrition and clean conditions were most critical for recovery. Religious and cultural beliefs might prohibit new mothers from consuming certain foods, drinking clean water, or leaving their contaminated birthing chambers for weeks after delivery. Herbal remedies and medicinal preparations given to new mothers were often prepared in unsanitary conditions and might actually introduce additional toxins and bacteria into women, whose immune systems were already compromised by the stress and blood loss of childbirth. The mortality rates for both mothers and babies in medieval childbirth were catastrophically high, with death rates that would be considered emergency public health crises by modern standards. Many of these deaths were directly caused by the unsanitary conditions and contaminated practices that surrounded medieval birth, creating infections that would kill healthy women and babies who should have survived normal deliveries. Puerperal fever, caused by bacterial infections introduced during birth, was one of the leading causes of death among new mothers, and these infections were directly related to the contaminated hands, instruments, and environments that characterized medieval midwifery. The social implications of high maternal and infant mortality rates affected entire communities and shaped medieval attitudes toward childbirth, women's health, and reproductive medicine. The knowledge that pregnancy and childbirth were likely to result in death created anxiety and fear that surrounded these natural processes with superstition and dread. The frequent deaths of mothers and babies reinforced beliefs that childbirth was inherently dangerous and that high mortality rates were natural and unavoidable, discouraging efforts to improve hygiene and birthing practices that might have saved countless lives.